Hey everyone, this is a section from the chapter titled Marxism and Existentialism on the Philosophy and Theory of Jean-Paul Sartre. The section and the chapter that is a chapter from Western Marxism and Introduction by Kornelia Hafner and Diethard Behrens. The section that is I'm going to be reading in this video is titled Philosophy and Existentialism 2. The last section I read, the last video, is titled Genesis of Consciousness and Excursus. It starts with a quote. It's in French. J'existe dans quelque chose existe de toute éternité est une proposition évidente, which translates as I exist, therefore something has existed from all eternity, is a self-evident proposition. And that's a quote from Voltaire. So here we go. For some time now, Sartre's philosophy has once again been a subject of general interest and widespread discussion. Rather than tracing this debate in detail, the aim here is to focus on the philosophical work itself. However, it is appropriate at this point to anticipate the discussion by referring to the text, les mots, the words. The reference to this work is not concerned with its literary theoretical aspect, but primarily with its philosophical dimension. The starting point here is the conception of the quote appropriation of things, having, end quote, as a quote mode of being, end quote. This fixation applies equally to words. Human beings too initially appear as things. Yet before addressing the self-doubt that arises in the wake of Descartes, one must point to the specific form of empiricism employed here. Its genesis cannot be divorced from the dispute surrounding the problem of universals in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The development of the nominalist tradition owes its origins to these debates. At the heart of the controversy lay the question of the nature of the quote essence, existence, and internal structure of the universal, end quote. Conceived as that quote common element, end quote, which promised to unite quote all things of a certain quality into a single entity, end quote. And let's see, that quote is from. That quote is from Hans Ulrich Wöhler. And it's from the introduction. Texte zum Universalstreit. Back to the body. From the time of Roscelin, Roscelin, at the latest, the universal has been reduced to the word as a quote being, and in Occam's view, to the nominal, to the sign. A consequence of this development is the realization that, while things and objects of knowledge can be distinguished, the designations applied to them are merely human constructs, rather than inherent in the nature of things. Ultimately, this renders the thing, the object, and God unknowable. Thinghood and abstraction have diverged. Footnote. quote, the knowing subject, therefore, I don't know why I'm saying doing the footnote, so I said I was not going to do that now. Sorry about that. Where was I? Sartre's point of departure from self-doubt culminates in a leap into existence. Man must become his own causa sui, and constitute himself as a being that, quote, necessarily creates itself as perfect, end quote. That is, becomes, quote, God himself, end quote. This occurs through writing. The religious motif becomes evident. His atheistic existentialism thus follows a, quote, religious model, and seeks legitimation solely through its incarnation as an aesthetic phenomenon, much like Nietzsche's philosophy. Let us return here to Sartrean philosophy in the strict sense. Modernity is to be defined in relation to phenomenalism and phenomenology. The critique is directed at what Sartre seeks to describe as, quote, inside-outside, end quote, referring to the relationship between essence and appearance. Implicit reference is made here to two theoretical approaches, those of Berkeley and Condillac. Essence and appearance, then, are subjected to critique. Appearance is not an, quote, inconsistent manifestation, quote, something beyond doing or a, quote, pure negative, but rather in light of Nietzsche's critique of, quote, backworldsmen, Hinterwäldler, it becomes, quote, full positivity, and its, quote, essence becomes a, quote, appearance that no longer stands in opposition to being, but, on the contrary, constitutes its measure, end quote. Quote, for the being of an existent is exactly that as which it appears. Thus we arrive at the idea of the phenomenon, end quote. The phenomenon is the existent. It is an absolute, to be distinguished from the merely relative. That is, from that which relates to consciousness. Insofar as sense of being is ascribed to the existent, one must reflect upon the, quote, transphenomenality of being, end quote. The phenomenon as an absolute is self-revealing. It discloses both its essence and its existence. The existent is conceived as an individual. Its singularity lies in its essence. Quote, the existent is a phenomenon. That is to say, it makes itself known as an organized whole of qualities. It reveals itself, not its being, end quote. Being is simply the precondition for all disclosure. It is a being toward disclosure, a being towards disclosure, rather than disclosed being. From this, it becomes clear that the being of beings must be distinguished from essence. Yet being itself remains the precondition for, quote, all givenness, end quote. The phenomenon reveals that being discloses itself as that which it is. This implies a critique of Aristotle as well, since, quote, the duality of potency and act, end quote, is eliminated. Quote, everything is in actu, end quote. Sartre. Quote, the essence of existence is the manifest law guiding the succession of its appearances. It is the rule, bracket, or raison, bracket, of the series, end quote. Sartre. A critical objection must be raised here. Insofar as appearances are to be understood as elements of an ontological order, they must be understood as expressions. Beings present themselves in two ways, as real and as imaginary. The imaginary points to the image, to visuality, and thus to sensibility and perception. These are incomplete approximations. The issue at stake, however, is the, quote, real transcendence of the being, end quote, since the being cannot be grounded in reality via the cogito. Consciousness is to be understood as a, quote, call for being, end quote, which implies for Sartre, quote, that the cogito refers immediately to a being in itself as the object of consciousness, end quote. Sartre. At first glance, there appears to be a dualism between the being in itself and the being for itself, modes of being Sartre initially regards as, quote, radically different, unquote. The for itself is to be conceived as united with the in itself through a, quote, synthetic connection, unquote, that is, quote, nothing other, unquote, than the for itself. For, in a Platonic vein, it is described as nothing other than a, quote, whole of being within being, end quote. Whole as in like a hole in the ground. Yet for Sartre, being possesses both a determinate and an indeterminate character. Being for itself is presented as an element of being. The question then arises as to how consciousness should be grasped. Should it be understood as an accident, or should one take the Platonic conception of the, quote, other as a starting point, thereby arriving at the notion of a philosophical hall of mirrors? For Sartre, it is evident that the for itself is an ideal phenomenon of consciousness. Its reality is, quote, interrogative, end quote. Contrary to Plato, it is postulated, quote, that being is an individual adventure, end quote. Sartre. But why, Sartre asks, does the for itself emerge from being? Quote, why is there being, end quote. For Sartre, the, quote, primacy of being over nothingness, end quote, is evident. Therefore, one must first turn to the question of being. To some extent, a traditional concept of being is, contra intentionem, being restored. If the phenomenon is to appear as transcendent, with the entity conceived as given in appearances, then perception must not focus on the qualities of the entity, but rather look through them toward a specific object. For Sartre, however, the critique of dualism initially means moving from one dualism to another, for that of the finite and the infinite. Yet the infinite and finite aspects of the entity reveal only one, quote, view of the object, end quote. The modification of appearances leads, assuming the presence of a subject, to an infinite series. The assumption of the finite simultaneously demonstrates the transition to the infinite. A kind of transcendence is inherent in the data themselves, signaling the difference between Dasein and non-Dasein-like entities, end quote. Sartre. Ultimately, this reproduces a dualism of inside and outside. The concept of potentiality, specifically that of possible appearances, also reemerges. Yet for Sartre, the established presuppositions give rise to a problem. The being of appearance. Appearance acquires a value of its own, a, quote, being of its own, end quote. The being of appearance is intended to be conceived independently of any subjectivity. Some of the points raised here are taken up again. The starting point is the distinction between being in itself and being for itself. Consciousness is thus something abstract because it contains within itself, quote, an ontological origin, end quote, directed toward the in itself, whereas the phenomenon is abstract because it appears to consciousness. Being is regarded as primordial. It can only be designated ontologically. Ontology also supplies the material for metaphysics, nor can an explanation of a possible cause for consciousness be achieved through a, quote, temporalization of consciousness, end quote, because that would amount to a mere, quote, unfolding of the surface, end quote. The ens causa sui necessarily manifest as a lack. Recourse to ontology makes it possible to bring solipsistic subjectivity into play alongside its failure. Quote, relative realities, such as acting and having, are also assigned to this project here. Ontology demonstrates that in grounding the in itself, the concept of presence is contained within that of the causa sui. It also shows that consciousness is, ideally, quote, actually a project, end quote, meaning that in self-grounding it seeks to attain, quote, the status of the in itself for itself, of the in itself as cause of itself, end quote. The fact that Sartre conceives of idealism as nominalist subjectivism and realism as object-oriented cognition indicates that scholastic patterns remain operative here. Sartre seeks to move beyond this dualism. Consciousness of something is intentional and transcendentally positing. It possesses a transphenomenal status. It is thus relative. When considered in itself, it is empty. Consciousness is conceived as relating to experience and perception, with the recognition that the latter is pre-reflective. Since subjectivity is subordinate to being, consciousness is accordingly, quote, knowable being, end quote, only insofar as it exists. Hence, the assumption of a pre-reflective cogito is compelling, for it is to be assumed of consciousness that, quote, emerging amidst beings, end quote, it maintains its essence. Existing consciousness is thus also the prerequisite for being able to conceive of a pure essence. Subjectivism is further developed. A limitation arises from the contradiction inherent in the grounding the world for itself. Quote, ontology can thus merely establish that everything happens as if the in itself, an sich, in a project to ground itself were to adopt the modification of the for itself. Metaphysics must subsequently propose hypotheses that allow one, quote, to grasp this process as the absolute event crowning the individual adventure, namely the existence of being, end quote. Metaphysics should attempt to determine the, quote, nature and meaning, end quote, of a, quote, prehistorical process and origin of all history, end quote. One that allows the, quote, individual adventure, end quote, the, quote, existence of the in itself, end quote, to be linked with the, quote, absolute event, end quote. Sartre. The philosophical question concerns the individual and their self-knowledge. It is necessary here to recapitulate in anticipation. In contrast to Descartes, the cogito is to be interpreted temporally and therefore psychologically. Consciousness and being as perceptum must be conceived as decoupled, just as being and beings must be identified. It is postulated that solipsism, if one abstracts from the idea of God, is a necessary consequence of thought. Also postulated is a pre-reflective cogito, the physis of thinking, or the assumption of a pre-conscious perceptivity, a physiological coloring of psychology. Existence can then be understood as self-distance, as being for itself. By tracing consciousness back to ss percipi, it is reduced to the psychic element. In Sartre's case, often the Erlebnis, lived experience as unreflected consciousness. This is always consciousness of something. Thus it recognizes, while simultaneously being something that does not cognize being, the opaque world, yet implies the being of which it is a part. The world and the perceiving element are given. Existence is evident to Sartre. Thus one can infer the existence of the other, as something projecting into one's own world by analogy. By addressing solipsism, the justification for existence, missing in Descartes, could then be inserted, thereby rehabilitating solipsism itself within the perspective of a phenomenological Cartesianism. Yet the foundation remains a psychological idealism. However, the distinct ontological qualities of the in itself and the for itself raise a problem. The for itself had been conceived as an abstraction. If one imagines it in conjunction with the in itself, the resulting totality would necessarily possess, quote, being or reality, end quote. If the for itself, existing outside the in itself, is merely a reflection, and otherwise a nothingness, the question of what is real, what possesses being, becomes more acute, given that every question confronts being and presupposes being. Consequently, the focus shifts away from cognition and toward, in Sartre's view, conduct or the act of establishing relations. This implies the negative as well. In this respect, there emerges a, quote, new component of the real, non-being, end quote. The discussion of the negative or of nothingness and of nothing points to aspects of what has elsewhere been termed dialectics. Nothingness points to negation. Sartre vehemently rejects interpreting negation as a form of judgment, and instead regards it as a constituent element in the immediate apprehension of things. Something either is or is not. Something is present or not. In contrast to consciousness, which is capable of constituting a, quote, consciousness of negation, end quote, one could, quote, never derive negation from being, end quote. Sartre. And I guess I should say all these quotes are coming from Being and Nothingness. At this point, one might ask whether, quote, being and non-being should be viewed as two complementary conditions of the real, end quote, analogous perhaps to light and shadow. This points to Hegel's position, to which reference is made at various stages. According to Sartre's interpretation, one must start from being in itself as, quote, full positivity, end quote, containing no negation. Consequently, a negative judgment is merely subjective. Affirmative and negative judgments, when opposed to one another, lead to a synthesis. Sartre emphasizes, the in itself points to a judgment, and this judgment, quote, as a wholly psychic positivity, end quote, in turn points to a being, since it, quote, formulates a negation concerning being, and consequently a transcendent one. Negation is the result of concrete psychic operations, possesses the existence of a noematic correlate. Its S consists, and I don't know if that's a proper, I guess it's a proper French word, ESSE. Its S consists precisely in its percipi, end quote. Sartre, Being and Nothingness. Non-being always appears within the horizon of, quote, human expectation, end quote, though this does not mean that, quote, non-being can be reduced to mere subjectivity, end quote. Rather, being possesses a status of its own. Human beings relate only to being. Quote, the being under consideration is this, a being within being. Author's note. Quote, the being under consideration is this, parenthesis, a being within being. Author's note, end parenthesis. So I guess like Behrens and Hafner's note. And nothing outside of it, end quote. Sartre. The consequence of this is that, quote, consciousness can produce a negation only in the form of a consciousness of negation, end quote. For, quote, one can never derive negation from being, end quote. Nevertheless, the question of nothingness must be pursued further. In his logic, Hegel examines, quote, the relationship between being and non-being, end quote. Sartre. Logic is the study of pure categories of thought. Logic's content is thought itself. One must subsequently determine whether these categories are true. Hegel's aim is to reveal the, quote, incompleteness of the concepts, end quote, in order to arrive at a, quote, more complete concept, a, quote, more complete concept, end quote, unquote, Sartre, that sublates the concepts and integrates the concepts, a formulation Sartre adopts following Laporte. Sartre interprets Hegel by drawing an analogy with the Porphyrian scheme. At the beginning of the logic, one finds being as the primary element, characterized by simple immediacy and a lack of determination. It is, quote, pure abstraction, end quote. It is, quote, pure abstraction, end quote, unquote, and thus, quote, the absolutely negative. And thus, quote, quote, the absolutely negative, end quote, unquote. Quote, nothing, end quote, unquote. For Hegel, pure being and pure nothing are the, quote, same, end quote. For the time being, Sartre contents himself with noting, quote, that Hegel reduces being to a meaning of the existent, end quote. It is, quote, encompassed by essence, which constitutes its foundation and its origin, end quote. This determination is open to question. Quote, insofar as being sublates being self in something else, being eludes the determinations of the understanding, but insofar as it sublates itself, that is the origin of its own sublation, in its innermost core, it must, on the contrary, appear to the understanding just as it is, end quote. Sartre. The term, quote, sublate, however, is highly problematic because it is ambiguous. Hegel's view, quote, according to which being and nothingness form two opposites whose difference, at the level of abstraction under consideration, is merely a matter of, quote, opinion, end quote, must also be re-examined. Misunderstanding Hegelian dialectics, the argument operates with a model of opposition and imputes this to Hegel. Non-being, however, stands in a, quote, contradictory, end quote, relation to being, implying, quote, a logical posteriority of nothingness, end quote. And being and non-being cannot be concepts of, quote, identical content, end quote, since non-being is, quote, negated undifferentiatedness, end quote. Hegel turns being into nothingness because he has already introduced negation into his concept of being. For being precedes negation. Quote, negation cannot reach the core of being, end quote. When Hegel emphasizes that being and nothingness are empty abstractions, i.e. the one as empty as the other, he forgets, quote, that the empty is empty of something, end quote. Sartre. One is always within being. Negation is merely a reflection upon it. A temporal order, a quote before and a quote after, must be posited as the underlying structure. And since every negation constitutes a determination, this implies, quote, that being is prior to nothingness and grounds it, end quote. That it is a being from which nothingness concretely derives its efficacy, end quote. Sartre. One is always within being. Negation is merely a reflection upon it. A temporal order, a quote before and a quote after, must be posited as the underlying structure. And since every negation constitutes a determination, this implies, quote, that being is prior to nothingness and grounds it, end quote. But that it is a being from which nothingness concretely derives its efficacy. End quote. Sartre. The foregoing demonstrates that Sartre draws upon Hegel's philosophy only in a few specific respects. Okay, and that's the end of this section's, like, the body paragraphs. So... now we got to go back to the footnotes. So if you find the footnotes irritating, you most certainly can skip ahead. If not, let's rock. Okay, so that Voltaire quote was from a piece titled Et Deschamps à remarque sur les pensées de Pascal, and it's from 1743. Footnote, and this is in relation to the sentence, for some time now, Sartre's philosophy has once again been a subject of general interest and widespread discussion. And the footnote says, the inappropriateness, bracket, of an approach, and bracket, becomes particularly evident in one specific interpretation, that of Haug. Haug regards Sartre as an Aristotelian with a Kantian turn. However, the Kantianism attributed to Sartre remains a construct of Haug's own making. Footnote, and this footnote is in relation to the sentence, the reference to les mots, or the words, the piece by Sartre. The reference to this work is not concerned with its literary theoretical aspect, but primarily with its philosophical dimension. And the footnote says, see Martin Zur's piece abbreviated Sartre. Zur, in turn, mirrors Sartre's own self-psychologization, yet nonetheless points to certain connections. Uncritical presentations of Sartre appear to be the norm. In Zur's work, the uncritical, or rather undistanced description and presentation, particularly of being and nothingness, is noteworthy, even if, contra intentionem, it also possesses an enlightenment character. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, yet before addressing the self-doubt that arises in the wake of Descartes, one must point to the specific form of empiricism employed here. And the footnote says, it is evident that Sartre draws upon neither ancient skepticism nor that of Hume. According to Skinner, Hume is not merely a follower of Locke and Berkeley. Rather, in his treatise, he was engaged primarily in a, quote, critical engagement with Bayle and in particular Malebranche, unquote. Quentin Skinner. In the book Visionen des Politischen, Visions of Politics. The engagement with Malebranche is palpable, whereas that with Bayle is scarcely discernible. Sartre, too, is free of this engagement. End footnote. And the next footnote is in reference to the same sentence that I just read. I'll read it again, fuck it. Yet before addressing the self-doubt that arises in the wake of Descartes, one must point to the specific form of empiricism employed here. Footnote, the fact that Sartre subsequently seeks to distinguish himself from this world of things as his argument develops does not preclude the question of whether the transcendence of this world, intended by the freedom of will, might not be merely a simple negative relationship. End footnote. One second, sorry. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, a consequence of this development is the realization that, while things and objects of knowledge can be distinguished, the designations applied to them are merely human constructs rather than inherent in the nature of things. Ultimately, this renders the thing, the object, and God unknowable. And the footnote says, quote, the knowing subject, therefore, does not move beyond the confines of its representations, and the signs employed as universals. ... If the object of knowledge is the unknown extramental thing, yet all statements referring to it are merely signs immanent to the subject, then the problem arises of how the universality and necessity of scientific propositions can be grounded beyond this immanence. In this respect, all modern theories of knowledge from Descartes to Husserl stand in the tradition of Occam and have inherited its aporias." End quote. And I believe that quote is from Günther Mensching's. Is there? Not sure what the piece is from. I think it's from the piece Das Allgemeine und Besondere der Ursprung des modernen Denkens im Mittelalter. The universal and the particular. The origin of modern thought in the Middle Ages. End quote. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence Sartre's point of departure from self-doubt culminates in a leap into existence. Man must become man's own cause, causa sui, and constitute himself as a being that, quote, necessarily creates itself as perfect, end quote. That is, becomes, quote, God himself, end quote. Footnote. And the footnote says, according to Martin Zur, Sartre draws upon the, quote, doctrine of predestination, end quote. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, the religious motif becomes evident, and this is kind of in relation to the last sentence. Quote, Sartre is well aware that his conception is guided by a religious paradigm, a mixture of Catholic salvation by works and Protestant justification, quote, by faith alone, end quote, end quote. Sartre. No, that's quote is from Martin Zur, excuse me. End footnote. The next citation is from is in relation to the sentence. Yeah. All right, I'll be in. In relation to the sentence. I don't think I actually have the footnote. I don't think the footnote came through. It's okay. Says, in this context, in this context also de Beauvoir's defense of existentialism written later, yet applicable to this specific line of thought. See Sartre's Being and Nothingness, an essay on phenomenological and ontology, translated by Hans Schoenberg and Traugott Koenig. This new translation contains a few minor errors. Leib, L-E-I-B, parenthesis, lived body, in parenthesis, is replaced by Körper, physical body, and following Sartre, Dasein is understood as, quote, human reality, unquote. The claim is made that Sartre's generation was shaped by, quote, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, unquote. At the same time, however, it is noted that, quote, their works were available only in fragmentary translations, which were moreover mostly very free and imprecise or simply incorrect, unquote. Sartre reportedly engaged with Hegel via Lefebvre. See Henri Lefebvre, Hegel, Morceau, Choisy, I don't know. Sartre, however, gives his interpretation a distinctive twist. He advocates a, quote, hermeneuticizing, end quote, of Hegel. The exposition constitutes a critique, specifically a suggestion of identity between critique and exposition. Sartre follows Kojève on the one hand and Heidegger on the other. End footnote. And the next footnote, I don't have it with its relation to. The question is also raised as to whether the overcoming of philosophical dualism via a, quote, monism of the phenomenon, end quote, succeeded. According to Hans-Georg Gadamer, Sartre adopted a, quote, genuine phenomenological motif, end quote, the, quote, pre-reflective cogito, end quote. See further below. Sartre also attempts to discuss the concept of phenomenalism. He distinguishes between two forms, an absolute form positing the esse percipi, meaning that what happens can only be, and a relative form referring only to, quote, extra-mundane realities, end quote, to beings. This is done in the name of an assumed realism. He fails to recognize the tradition of early French positivism. Okay. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence. Actually, I don't have that information. But the footnote says, just as there is no, quote, outside to the existent, i.e. to the being, so too is there no, quote, inside that constitutes the truth. Quote, and this true nature, for its part, does not exist if it is supposed to be the secret reality of the thing, end quote, because it is internal. Quote, the appearance that manifests the existent are neither internal nor external. They are all equivalent to one another. They all point to other appearances, and none of them is privileged, end quote. Jean-Paul Sartre. The category of essence, however, lies on a different level. The reference to the example of force, which for Sartre is not a, quote, metaphysical natus, end quote, but rather the, quote, totality of effects, end quote, demonstrates not only an empiricist approach, but also that the nature and conceptual distinctions of law, concept, and descriptive criterion, along with the language of science, are foreign to him. For him, nothing lies behind this. There is only the, quote, total series, which he regards as empirical. And footnote. Footnote. See Barclay, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. End footnote. Footnote. See also the remarks on Barclay in Sartre's study and regarding the connection to the phenomenist tradition since Condillac, the reference to one of his theorems. See Ernst Cassirer, The Philosophy of the Enlightenment. While for Descartes the aim was to, quote, go back from phenomena to principles, end quote. This changes subsequently as physiology moves to the center of interest. Already with Barclay, the problem of knowledge is restricted to perception. This leads to a psychologism that introduces the distinction between perception, sensory impression, and Wahrnehmung, conscious perception, a distinction to which Tettens subsequently responds. Footnote. For a critique of the concept of, quote, appearing, see Sartre, let et le na, I don't know. As with Heidegger, semblance or shine and appearing, erscheinen, are conflated. End footnote. Footnote. On the one hand, Sartre emphasizes, quote, states present themselves as actually existing, end quote. On the other, he adopts a different conception following Heidegger. Quote, the appearance does not conceal the essence, it reveals it. It is the essence, end quote. The essence of the being is not in, quote, interior. It is the law of the sequence of appearances, the, quote, ground of the series, end quote. Sartre seeks to argue that quiditas and existentia must be separated. In this way, however, both are empty. Appearing is to be its essence. While Husserl held that essence links the multiplicity of the being, Sartre attempts, by negating the classical meaning of essence and transforming it into an element of appearance, to make it, too, a moment of intuition. On this context, see Thomas de Most, and regarding Heidegger and Husserl, specifically concerning the relationship between phenomenology and ontology, see Günther Figal and Hans Helmut Gonder, Heidegger und Husserl, Neue Perspektiven. Footnote: manifestations as moments of the series or causal chain must, however, be regarded as qualities. Footnote: see Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote, Zarathustra's speeches on the backworldsman. And footnote. Footnote. Here it is posited as a simple realist position, how one appearance is supposed to become the measure of another. However, it remains Sartre's secret. Sartre's critique is formally directed at Hegel, but de facto at Heidegger as well. The latter conceives of the phenomenon differently. It should also be noted that Sartre strips epistemology of its linguistic character. Footnote: this is intended to express that, quote, beings reveal themselves fundamentally in an infinite multiplicity of appearances or givens, which can show them as, quote, different time and again, end quote. Thomas de Most. Here the being takes on the character of something substantial, or that of an essence. In this respect, Sartre also differs from Heidegger. He regards the identification of being and phenomenon as vulgar. Footnote: from this, and this is in relation to the sentence, from this it becomes clear that the being of beings must be distinguished from essence, yet being itself remains the precondition for, quote, all givenness, end quote. And the footnote says, Sartre's concept of being is unclear. On the one hand, Sartre's concept of being signifies the totality of qualities, pointing to moods, while on the other, the, quote, totality of contents, end quote, is also supposed to exist independently of the subjective. In this respect, what is meant in Sartre's work oscillates between the being of appearance and the being of the being. Consequently, the problem remains of how to conceive the connection between the, quote, phenomenology of being and the, quote, being of the phenomenon, end quote. Thomas de Most. And footnote. And the next footnote is in reference to the sentence, the phenomenon reveals that being discloses being self is that which it is. Footnote: in Sartre's work, this extends to a syllogism of things. His philosophy is thus detached from language. It is the things themselves that carry their meaning within them. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, quote, everything is inactive, end quote. Sartre. And the footnote says, behind the act there is supposedly neither potency nor hexus, habitus. At the same time, this is intended as a critique of the substance-accident model, which views appearances as a disordered sensory world. End footnote. Quote, the essence of an existent is the manifest law guiding the succession of its appearances. It is the rule, or raison, of the series. End quote. Sartre. And the footnote says, however, the infinite series of appearances has an analog in the infinite series of commodity objects cast onto the market. Yet it is suggested that the series of appearances possesses an infinity of its own. This implies either a perspective exposition die or constitutes an illicit inductive inference drawn from an isolated context. Footnote, quote, but ultimately the essence, as the rule of the series, is merely the bond of the appearances. That is, it is itself an appearance, end quote. This explains how there can be essences, or in Husserlian terms, an intuition of essences. Wesenschau, quote, phenomenal being, end quote, manifest, quote, essence, and quote, existence, and is nothing other than, quote, the firmly connected series of these manifestations, end quote. There is no reflection on the fact that appearances are the effects of experiments with any specific theory that dictates the dimension of inquiry. Since Bacon, quote, series has signified a causal connection. For Plato, a hierarchy, and in the French tradition since Bonnet, an infinite chain of being, an assumption that fell prey to criticism from Voltaire, Diderot, and de Holbach. In Kant, it reads as follows, quote, here, then, appearances are regarded as given, and reason demands the absolute completeness of the conditions of their possibility, insofar as these constitute a series, consequently and absolutely, i.e. in every respect, complete synthesis, whereby the appearance can be exhibited in accordance with the laws of the understanding. End quote. Kant. Footnote. This is the point at which Sartre distinguishes himself from Husserl's theory of perception. The imaginary is conceived as non-being. Accordingly, following Demast here, the, quote, distinction between aspects of the existent that appear, quote, in the flesh, end quote, leibhaftig, and those that do not, end quote, is understood in terms of the ontological opposition between, quote, being and, quote, nothingness. Sartre then replaces Husserlian, quote, bodily presence, end quote, with, quote, possible appearances, end quote, which Sartre attributes to Husserl. End footnote. And the next footnote is in reference to the sentence, the issue at stake, however, is the, quote, real transcendence of the being, end quote, since the being cannot be grounded in reality via the cogito. And the footnote says, this, however, appears to compel Sartre when he seeks to derive the, quote, existential determinations of Dasein from the inner constitution of transcendental phenomenological subjectivity, end quote, it to shift in turn toward a radical subjectivism. End footnote. Consciousness is to be understood as a, quote, call for being, end quote, which implies for Sartre, quote, that the cogito refers immediately to being in itself. Where am I? Fucked up. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, consciousness is to be understood as a, quote, call for being, end quote, which implies for Sartre, quote, that the cogito refers immediately to a being in itself as the object of consciousness, end quote. Sartre. And the footnote says, according to Gadamer, Sartre identifies consciousness with intentionality, whereas being is conceived in Eleatic terms. Yet, embedded here is Sartre's fascination with, quote, conceptless experience, end quote, as well as a form of thinking with things that transcends language, pointing to the context of the absolute and the absurd. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, at first glance, there appears to be a dualism between the being in itself and the being for itself, modes of being Sartre initially regards as, quote, radically different, end quote. Sartre. And the footnote says, this in turn points back to starting points in Descartes and in mechanical materialism or nominalism. Fundamentally, the discussion centers on the thing, isolated as simple self-identity, and the human being. The thing, or the world, is then pure positivity, whereas the human being is to be understood as, quote, being for itself, negativity, non-identity, the lack of self-coincidence, end quote. Martin Zur. End footnote. The next footnote is into this is in relation to the sentence. The for itself is to be conceived as united with the in itself through a, quote, synthetic connection, end quote, that is, quote, nothing other, end quote, than the for itself. For in a Platonic vein, it is described as nothing other than a, quote, whole of being within being, end quote. And the footnote says, underlying this are A, perspective rooted in the philosophy of nature, and B, an ontological structure analogous to the ether theory of antiquity and Descartes. At one point, Sartre conflates, quote, being with a capital B and, quote, being with a lowercase b, parenthesis, or, quote, that which is, end quote, end parenthesis. Attention is also drawn there to a translation difficulty. Quote, the Sein, parenthesis, essentia, end parenthesis, of this being must be grasped from its Sein, existentia, parenthesis, existentia, in parenthesis, end quote. Heidegger. Sartre translates le commun, parenthesis, essentia, and parenthesis, de se et droit, I don't know, et concu à partir de son et existentia, end quote. Sartre. Footnote, quote, the pour soi, or the pour soi, being for itself is not nothingness in general, but a specific privation. It constitutes itself as the privation of this being, end quote. Jean-Paul Sartre. The fiction of the privatum as a state of consciousness is evident here, ideal as a realm of mental representation. Consciousness is said to be oriented toward a, quote, transphenomenality of being, end quote, just as subjectivity is said to be dependent on being. Now, according to Demirović, Sartre aims to show how the, quote, transphenomenality of subjectivity demands the transphenomenality of, quote, being, end quote, end quote. Thomas Demirović. Consciousness becomes something transcendent. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, if I can find it. Should it be understood as an accident, or should one take the Platonic conception of the quote other as a starting point, thereby arriving at the notion of a philosophical hall of mirrors? Footnote. If the cogito refers to a thing, this implies the following, quote, there is no being for consciousness outside this precise necessity of being an unveiling intuition of something. What does this mean? If not that consciousness is the Platonic, quote, other, end quote, Sartre. End footnote. And the next footnote's in reference to the same sentence. Plato could have, so it is posited here, gone even further and seen, quote, that the other or relative non-being could have something like existence only as consciousness, end quote. This much is already found in Cartesian rationalist empiricism. Quote, and what then can alterity be, if not the back and forth between the mirrored and the mirroring, within the pour soi, bracket for itself? Alterity is, after all, internal negation, and only a consciousness can constitute itself as internal negation, end quote. Sartre. In conclusions. For Sartre, it is evident that the for itself is an ideal phenomenon of consciousness. That's the reference. That's the sentence that this next footnote is in reference to. Quote, thus the pour soi is a, quote, dependent absolute, what we have called a non-substantial absolute, end quote. Waldenfels interprets the connection as follows, quote, the result only an egoless, impersonal field of consciousness exhibits a self-transparency and self-availability that guarantees consciousness its character of absoluteness. This consciousness is a nothingness because all objects, truths, and values lie outside it. It is everything because it is consciousness of all that. End quote. Bernhard Waldenfels. It is this essentially solipsistic consciousness. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, and likewise, the appearance of the for itself is the absolute event that happens to being, end quote. Sartre. End footnote. And the next footnote is to the reference to the sentence, quote, why is there being, end quote. For Sartre, quote, the primacy of being over nothingness, end quote, is evident. And the footnote says, an interpolation derived from the philosophy of nature has been introduced here. Being and beings appear undifferentiated. For Sartre, consciousness and perception are undifferentiated. End footnote. Footnote. And this is in reference to the sentence. For Sartre, however, the critique of dualism initially means moving from one dualism to another, that of the finite and the infinite. Footnote. If, however, the appearance is constantly transcended, this implies that the object posits, quote, this series of appearances, end quote. While the appearance is finite, it is thus extended into the infinite. This points back to Husserl, as Demas notes, to a, quote, inner horizon, end quote. The dichotomy is not abandoned, however. The, quote, either or, end quote, skepticism versus non-skepticism stands as evidence of this. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, "Yet the infinite and finite aspects of the entity reveal only one, quote, view of the subject," end quote. Footnote. The fact that the being exists in its materiality is also a condition. Sorry, I'm fucking spacing out here. Yet the infinite and finite aspects of the entity reveal only one, quote, view of the object, end quote. And the footnote says, the fact that being exists in its materiality is also a condition for speaking of its appearance. The, quote, continuum of givens, end quote, constitutes this condition. End footnote. The modification of appearances, the next footnote is in reference to the sentence, the modifications of appearances leads, assuming the presence of a subject, to an infinite series. And the footnote says, quote, let us bear in mind that our theory of the phenomenon replaces the reality of the thing with the objectivity of the phenomenon and grounds the latter in an infinite regress, end quote. Sartre. Objectivity is, however, reduced to the subjective when a concept of the object, a transcending of the phenomenon, is to be formed. The criterion of the object is merely empirical, in stark contrast to the phenomenon. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, the assumption of the finite simultaneously demonstrates the transition to the infinite. And the footnote says, it follows from Sartre's empiricist presupposition, quote, but if the transcendence of the object is grounded in the necessity that appearance can always be transcended, it follows that an object posits the series of appearances as infinite in principle. Thus the appearance, which is infinite, reveals itself in its finitude, yet simultaneously demands to be transcended toward the finite, end quote. If one were to view this against the backdrop of the religious, one might note in commentary on Sartre that one arrives at Catholic theological topoi. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, a kind of transcendence is inherent in the data themselves, signaling the difference between Dasein and non-Dasein-like entities. Okay. This also hints at the intended shift from beings to being, and thus the movement, quote, from the individual to the eidos. End quote. Ultimately, this reproduces a dualism of inside and outside. The concept of potentiality, specifically that of possible appearances, also reemerges. For Sartre, the established presuppositions give rise to a problem, the being of appearance. Footnote, quote, if the essence of the appearance is an, quote, appeasing, that is no longer opposed to any being, there arises a legitimate problem regarding the being of this appearing, end quote. Sartre. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, appearance acquires a value of its own, a quote, being of its own, end quote. And the footnote says, subsequently the question shifts toward the, quote, being of the phenomenon, end quote. Here a variation is played on Heidegger's, quote, being of beings, end quote. In both cases, the question of the subject of knowledge is excluded. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, the being of appearance is intended to be conceived independently of any subjectivity. And it says, the being of phenomena, however, can only be grasped through a phenomenological hermeneutic approach. At the same time, it is noted that every phenomenon is a transcendent being and, insofar as it points to other phenomena, that there is thus a, quote, fullness of being, end quote. Regarding Sartrean hermeneutics, see Edward Mahler. There one finds a reference to the specific genealogy of hermeneutics in Sartre. Schleiermacher, Ost, Wolff, and elsewhere indications of structuralist elements in his theory of language and his linguistic, quote, dialectics. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, some of the points raised here are taken up again. The starting point is the distinction between being in itself and being for itself. And the footnote says, Descartes supposedly faced a, quote, similar problem, the relationship between, quote, soul and body. However, analysis and synthesis are distinct, such that, quote, the results of analysis did not coincide with the elements of the synthesis, end quote. In contrast, Sartre maintains that the concrete is, quote, a totality, end quote, capable of, quote, existing by itself, end quote. Husserl, he suggests, views the matter similarly. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, consciousness is thus something abstract because it contains within itself, quote, an ontological origin, end quote, directed toward the in itself, whereas the phenomenon is abstract because the phenomenon appears to consciousness. And the footnote says, transcendence is a constitutive element of consciousness. Hirsch sketches a simple, naive picture of this pair of concepts. Quote, to be, in itself, that is the mode of being of the world of things, which is identical with itself, end quote. Quote, to be for itself, that is the mode of being conscious subjects. That is the mode of being of conscious subjects, end quote. Johann Hirsch. Accordingly, transcendence is merely the subjective projecting beyond the world of things. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, being is regarded as primordial. And the footnote says, quote, being is without ground, bracket, raison, end bracket, without cause and without necessity, end quote. Sartre, being in nothingness. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, being can only be designated ontologically. And the footnote says, quote, there is, end quote, being, because the for itself is such that there is being, end quote. Sartre, being in nothingness. To connect ontology and consciousness, it is assumed, following Heidegger, that a metaphysics precedes every act of cognition. The fact that this leads to a metaphysical relativism goes unrecognized. Sartre, however, goes a step further. In his reading based on the theory of principles, metaphysics and ontology coincide. The understanding of being is held to be preconceptual. Implicit reference is made to the, quote, disclosure of being, end quote, in a pre-ontological context. Footnote, it can only be where am I? End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, ontology also supplies the material for metaphysics. And it says, the footnote says, from this perspective, it is maintained, quote, that every process of self-grounding constitutes a rupture in the identity of the in itself, unquote, which points to an empiricized being in Sartre and the assumption, quote, only by making itself into a for itself could being strive to be the cause of itself, unquote. Sartre. Sartre attempts to circumvent the fact that no cognition is possible from a solipsistic standpoint. End footnote. And the next footnote is in reference to the sentence, nor can an explanation of a possible cause for consciousness be achieved through a, quote, temporalization of consciousness, unquote, because that would amount to mere, quote, unfolding on the surface, unquote. 3891. Let me repeat that. This is the sentence that this footnote is a reference to. Nor can an explanation of a possible cause for consciousness be achieved through a, quote, temporalization of consciousness, unquote, because that would amount to a mere, quote, unfolding of the surface, end quote. Sartre. And the footnote says, here Sartre refers to Befindlichkeit, state of mind / attunement, mood and feeling. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, recourse to ontology makes it possible to bring solipsistic subjectivity into play alongside its failure. Footnote, it is thus clear, quote, that the pour soi, or bracket, being for itself, in bracket, is effectively a continuous project of grounding itself as being, and the continuous failure of this project, end quote. Sartre. Reflection, which Sartre technically understands as mirroring, constitutes a, quote, doubling of the project, end quote. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, quote, relative realities, such as acting and having, are also assigned to this project here. And the footnote says, quote, acting and, quote, having, as the main categories of human reality, reduce themselves directly or indirectly to the project of being, end quote. Sartre. From this perspective, however, a static mode of viewing articulates itself, something Sartre does not initially notice. End footnote. Footnote. At the same time, Sartre emphasizes another element, Husserlian nomata, are to be interpreted ontologically. For him, the consequence of this is that he declares them unreal. End footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the sentence, consciousness of something is intentional and transcendentally positing. And the footnote says, quote, to be knowledge of, quote, something, consciousness must simultaneously possess, quote, consciousness of itself, end quote, as knowing, end quote. Thomas de Most. Consciousness must therefore be doubly determined. Footnote. Quote, to be knowledge of, quote, something, consciousness must simultaneously possess, quote, consciousness of itself, end quote, as knowing, end quote. I already said this footnote. Jesus Christ. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, consciousness posits a transphenomenal status. Consciousness possesses a transphenomenal status. It is thus relative. When considered in itself, it is empty. And the footnote says the connection to the world must then first be established. End footnote. Consciousness is conceived as relating to experience and perception, with the recognition that the latter is pre-reflective. And the footnote says, there are, quote, syntheses of recognition, end quote. References made here to Plato's anamnesis. See the overly imminent account given by Thomas de Most. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, since subjectivity is subordinate to being, consciousness is accordingly, quote, knowable being, end quote, only insofar as it exists. And the footnote says, the relationship between consciousness and existence is said to be circular. Conscious existence exists as the existing of consciousness. Footnote. This implies that this, like consciousness, exists beforehand. And that's in reference to the sentence, for it to be assumed that consciousness that, quote, for it is to be assumed of consciousness that, quote, emerging amidst beings, end quote, it maintains its essence. This implies that this, like consciousness, exists beforehand. End footnote. Existing consciousness is thus also the prerequisite for being able to conceive of a pure essence. And the footnote says, wait, did I say the footnote already? The footnote says, this implies that like consciousness exists beforehand. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, a limitation arises from the contradiction inherent in grounding the world in the for itself. Quote, ontology, and the footnote says, this is a construct analogous to modern constructivism. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, quote, ontology can thus merely establish that everything happens as if the in itself, an sich, in a project to ground itself, were to adopt the modification of the for itself. End quote. The quote is from Thomas de Most, I think, and, well, yeah, it is. And the footnote says, "This is to be read as a hypothetical construct. The absence of a subject which suddenly appears here is adopted from Heidegger. When Sartre's, quote, phenomenological ontology, end quote, undertakes to discover, quote, the ontological foundations of the knower and the known, end quote, it simultaneously postulates that consciousness transcends the object, just as the object is not exhausted by, quote, being perceived, end quote. This corresponds to the notion that things are transcendent to consciousness, or rather that consciousness is to be understood merely instrumentally, as translucent. A mode of being is presupposed for both the subjective and the objective." This is said to be the structure of, quote, see Martin Zur, Jean-Paul Sartre. This is said to be the structure of quote, pre-reflexive thinking, end quote. Regarding the, quote, pre-reflective cogito, unquote, see Christa Hakenesch, Jean-Paul Sartre. It also becomes clear that this is quasi-transcendent, placing form before content, which leads Sartre into contradiction. The fact that echoes of the Platonic tradition inevitably arise demonstrate that Sartre's demarcation from that tradition is inconsistent. End footnote. And the next sentence is titled, "Metaphysics should attempt to determine the, quote, nature and meaning, end quote, of a, quote, prehistorical process and origin of all history, end quote. One that allows the, quote, individual adventure, end quote, the, quote, existence of the in itself, end quote, to be linked with the, quote, absolute event, end quote." And the footnote says, "In one instance, the related formulation regarding, quote, temporality, which, quote, happens to being through the pour soi, being for itself, and seeks to bypass historical becoming, is defined by subjectivization of the état, parenthesis, that which is, end parenthesis. In another instance, however, the construct of the origin of a, quote, prehistorical process, end quote, is marked by a latent engagement with the question of religion, to the extent that recourse is made to metaphysics, an attempt to establish a religious foundation, one that is only weakly latent, becomes visible." End footnote. The next footnote says, "The philosophical question concerns the individual and their self-knowledge." The footnote says, Hakenesch emphasizes that his concern is the freedom of the individual. Freedom signifies that of the, quote, existence of the individual, unquote. To put it more pointedly, it is the consciousness of individuals within the contingency of their existence, consciousness, that cannot appeal to any truth independent of that existence. This immediately invites objections. A, it is nonsense to designate individuals as subjects, coupled with a fear of engaging with theology. Linked to this, as with Heidegger, is the tendency to wish to remain a pre-Socratic and to deny the transcendence of the ontological horizon. B, conceiving of existence as situated in contingency implies negative freedom. Positive freedom in Sartre's view belongs only to what precedes existence, transcendent powers, ontological origins. End footnote. Come on, you piece of shit. Okay, so the next footnote, where am I at? The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, it is necessary here to recapitulate in anticipation. Or I guess I'll read the whole fuller sentence. The philosophical question concerns the individual and their self-knowledge. It is necessary here to recapitulate in anticipation. And the footnote says, see Jean-Paul Sartre, Bewusstsein und Selbsterkenntnis, which I think is consciousness and self-knowledge. So I think that translates as, of 1947. This text demonstrates that Sartre's thought exhibits continuity, contrary to the assumption held by many interpreters that he changed his philosophical stance under the impact of the upheavals of 1944. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, in contrast to Descartes, the cogito is to be interpreted temporally and therefore psychologically. Footnote, quote, the being of knowledge is the being of the human who knows, end quote. Elsewhere, one finds more of a defense of Descartes. Cassirer had pointed out that Kant's critical philosophy goes hand in hand with a critique of positions attempting to dissolve epistemology and logic into psychology, thereby emphasizing the special status of logical thought. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, it is postulated that solipsism, if one abstracts from the idea of God, is a necessary consequence of thought. And the footnote says, in Sartre's own account, this abstraction is itself conceived in abstract terms, quite analogously to the defensive stance of the liberal bourgeoisie, conceived in atomistic terms, vis-a-vis an absolutist monarch. It perceives itself as distinct, yet remains unsure of that distinction, and thus fails to grasp the actual situation. End footnote. Also postulated as a pre-reflective cogito, the physis of thinking, or the assumption of a pre-conscious perceptivity, a physiological coloring of psychology, existence can then be understood as self-distance, as being for itself. Footnote, this assumption applies to consciousness as well. It is presented as pre-reflective, yet this excluded consciousness proves to be a precondition. End footnote. By tracing consciousness back to ss percipi, it is reduced to the psychic element, in Sartre's case often the Erlebnis, lived experience, as unreflected consciousness. This is always consciousness of something. I don't know. I fucked that up. Where am I? This next footnote is in relation to this sentence. Where the hell did I go? I got distracted. By addressing solipsism, the justification for existence missing in Descartes could then be inserted, thereby rehabilitating solipsism itself within the perspective of a phenomenological Cartesianism. Yet the foundation remains a psychological idealism. And the footnote says, quote, Sartre remains a Cartesian, end quote. And that quote's from Hans-Georg Gadamer in Das Sein und das Nichts. Back to the text. However, the distinct ontological qualities of the in itself and the for itself raise a problem. These next footnotes are in relation to this sentence. However, the distinct ontological qualities of the in itself and the for itself raise a problem. The for itself had been conceived as an abstraction. Footnote, consciousness, as intentional, is always consciousness of something, a quote, immediate intuition of something, end quote, Sartre. This implies, in line with Berkeley, that the content is posited simultaneously with consciousness, yet itself. Yet consciousness as a production of the I is also supposed to be ontologically directed toward another being. Sartre's ontological proof, however, remains a mere positing. The same applies to the quote, known object. The phenomenon as an object for us, it, too, is presupposes a quote, trans-phenomenal being, end quote. Thus the phenomenon appears in a dual sense, first in relation to the act of knowing, as the trans-phenomenal ground of perceiving, the being of knowing, and second in relation to the object, as the trans-phenomenal ground of being perceived, the being of the extramental object. Both are subsumed under the concept of being in general and its condition existence. If the human being is to be defined as the concrete, quote, being in the world, end quote, Heidegger, or as Hochgräber puts it, quote, as Dasein in the Heideggerian sense, we act within the horizon of our projections, i.e. in a world, end quote. Wolfgang Hochgräber. Then this very state must be understood as a, quote, synthetic relationship, and the anthropological and worldly conditions must be elucidated. End footnote. And the next footnote is in relation to the set line. The for itself had been conceived as an abstraction, same as the last footnote. And the footnote is a quote from being in consciousness, quote, being in nothingness, quote, a consciousness that were the consciousness of nothing would be an absolute nothing, end quote. Sartre. For Hesiod, nothingness is synonymous with the unordered, with chaos, and is simultaneously the absolute void prior to the creation of the world. See Castoriadis, Philosophie Demokratie. Olaf Gigon, der Ursprung der griechischen Philosophie von Hesiod bis Parmenides. Work in Days. And the next footnote is in relation to the sentence, if the for itself exists outside the in itself, is merely a reflection, and otherwise a nothingness, the question of what is real, what possesses being, becomes more acute. And the footnote says, the question arises primarily because Sartre fails to distinguish sufficiently between being, parenthesis, sein, end parenthesis, and beings, parenthesis, seiendes, end parenthesis, thereby equating pan and holon, everything or whole. Gadamer puts this more sharply. Gadamer identifies Sartre's conception of, quote, full being with the Eleatic concept. Glinka attempts to salvage the position. Glinka argues that Sartre grasped Hegel's logic. He himself interprets the logic as, quote, not purely formal, but equally ontological and metaphysical, end quote. This would imply that logic in the proper sense is sacrificed here, as the various levels are conflated. The next footnote says, the discussion of the negative of nothingness and nothing points to aspects of what has elsewhere been termed dialectics. And there's two footnotes here. in relation to that sentence, Sartre emphasizes the distinction between nothingness and nothing, rien, R-I-E-N, the quote, absence of things, parenthesis, nichts an Dingen, and parenthesis. Sartre disregards the fact, despite the view that being is always the being of something, that Parmenides had already preceded him in this regard, specifically when Parmenides states, as Hegel reports, that, quote, being is, but nothingness is not at all, unquote, while simultaneously overlooking the contradiction contained therein between absolute positing and absolute negation. And the next footnote says, si Albert Van Riet de Hegel à Sartre pour une pratique de la raison critique. And Van Riet, in the footnote says, Van Riet posits the presence of a critical reason in Sartre, but what does this actually represent? The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, nothingness points, Sartre vehemently rejects interpreting negation as a form of judgment, and instead regards negation as a constituent element. And the footnote says, an initial approach states, quote, negation as the result of concrete psychic operations, end quote, has, quote, its S-E-S-S-E in its percipi, end quote. Non-being appears as the human being's relationship to the world. This also implies that every being contains non-being. Quote, a being is fragile if it harbors within its being a specific possibility of non-being, end quote. Sartre. Footnote. The finding that a person is present or absent, as appears in Sartre's examples, demonstrates that this finding is de facto a judgment. However, a judgment regarding existence would then require a higher authority capable of adjudicating on being. In that case, however, Sartre would be right back with Descartes. End footnote. Did I say what the sentence I was in relationship to? I don't know. Sorry, I was spacing out. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence. At this point, one might ask whether, quote, being and non-being should be viewed as two complementary components of the real, end quote, analogous perhaps to light and shadow. Footnote, quote, pure being and pure nothingness would be two abstractions, the mere union of which would form the basis of concrete realities, end quote. Sartre. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, according to Sartre's interpretation, one must start from being in itself, as, quote, full positivity, containing no negation. And the footnote says, Wolfgang Fritzhau conceives of the Sartrean in itself as an ahistorical synthesis of, quote, of self with self, end quote. Haug. And the next footnote, which is in reference to the same sentence, according to Sartre's interpretation, one must start from being in itself as, quote, full positivity containing no negation. Quote, a real cause produces a real effect, and the cause being is entirely committed to positivity by the cause. To the extent that it depends on the cause for its being, there cannot be within it the slightest germ of nothingness, end quote. Sartre, Being in Nothingness. Thus nothingness appears beyond the impression that it shimmers upon things as a completely subjective element. The next footnote says, affirmative and is in reference to the sentence, affirmative and negative judgments, when opposed to one another, lead to synthesis. Footnote, negation is interpreted with implicit reference to Descartes as a questioning doubt. And footnote. And the next footnote, which is in reference to the same sentence, the result of this regarding negation is said to be that it remains isolated at the conclusion of the judgment, not situated within being. Quote, it is like something unreal enclosed between two full realities, end quote. Sartre. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, negation as the result of concrete psychic operations possesses the existence of noematic correlate. Its ESSE, consists precisely in its percipi. And the footnote says, Sartre subsequently emphasizes that the question concerning the origin of negation and nothingness must be raised. For Hegel, the determination is different. If being is conceived as relation to self over against its relation to other, as equality with self over against its inequality, end quote, then, quote, such being is being in itself, end quote, Hegel. Or, quote, being in the something is being in itself, being the relation to self, equality with self, end quote. Since something contains non-being as other, being is conceived in relation to the latter. Quote, thus being in itself is primarily a negative relation to non-determinate being, end quote. Hegel. The in itself could then be further determined, quote, but what something is only in itself is only in it, quote, in itself, end quote, is a merely abstract and thus external determination, end quote. Hegel. For Sartre, the in itself stands for the object, or a simple, quote, something, in which all immanent differentiating determination is negated. The next sentence says, Sartre interprets Hegel by drawing an analogy with the Porphyrian scheme. Footnote, quote, for Hegel, the true concrete is the existent together with its essence, the totality produced through the synthetic integration of all abstract moments, end quote. Hegel then has being transition into essence. And that quote, I don't know if I said Sartre at the end of it, but that quote is from Sartre. The next sentence says, it is, quote, encompassed by essence, which constitutes its foundation and its origin, end quote. The footnote says, quote, Hegel's entire theory rests on the idea that a philosophical step is required to rediscover, at the beginning of logic, the immediate from the perspective of the mediated, and the abstract from the perspective of the concrete that grounds it, end quote. Sartre. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence that says, this determination is open to question. Which comes right after the last sentence for the last footnote. And the footnote says, quote, nothingness actually, quote, is nothingness, actually not mere identity with itself, complete emptiness, and absence of determinacy and content, end quote. The doubt concerns above all the statement that, quote, every determination is negation, end quote. It is thus, in truth, a demarcation vis-a-vis Spinoza. And the next footnote is in relation to the sentence. The term, quote, sublate, Aufheben, however, is highly problematic because it is ambiguous. Footnote. Aufheben, sublation, appears at times as, quote, an eruption from the deepest depths of the being under consideration, end quote, and at other times as, quote, an external movement, end quote, that sweeps being along with it. End footnote. The next sentence is in relation to the sentence. Next footnote is in relation to the sentence. Misunderstanding Hegelian dialectics. The argument operates with a model of opposition and imputes this to Hegel. Quote, to contrast being with nothingness in the Hegelian manner, like thesis and antithesis, means presupposing a logical simultaneity between them, end quote. Thus, quote, two opposites, end quote, emerge, which, as simultaneous, can be positive. If one were to speak of simultaneous opposites, it must be objected here, one would require a judging subject capable of establishing this. Footnote. Since Sartre, on the basis of his psychological phenomenology, introduces a distinction between processes in time and logical argumentation, he is bound to misunderstand Hegel. Sorry, I fucked that up. That footnote's in relation to the sentence. Non-being, however, stands in a, quote, contradictory relation to being, implying, quote, a logical posteriority of nothingness, end quote. And being and non-being cannot be concepts of, quote, identical content, end quote, since non-being is, quote, negated undifferentiatedness, end quote. Since Sartre, on the basis of his psychological phenomenology, introduces a distinction between processes in time and logical argumentation, he is bound to misunderstand Hegel. And the next footnote is in relation to the sentence. When Hegel emphasizes that being and nothingness are empty abstractions, i.e. the one is empty as the other, he forgets, quote, that the empty is empty of something, end quote. And the footnote says, quote, yet being is empty of any determination other than identity with being self, but non-being is empty being, end quote. Sartre. It is evident, Sartre claims, quote, that being is and that nothingness is not, end quote. Sartre. The status of Hegelian conceptual terminology is misunderstood. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the sentence, one is always within being, negation is merely a reflection upon it. And the footnote says, this is also interpreted as a merely temporal structure in which cognition appears as psychologically determined. Quote, every psychic process of alienation thus implies a cut between the immediate psychic past and the present, end quote. Sartre. This cut is said to be nothingness. This conception has its counterpart in Heidegger's. Footnote, and since every negate, and the next footnote is in relation to the sentence, and since every negation constitutes a determination, this implies, quote, that being is prior to nothingness and grounds it, end quote. That it is a being from which nothingness concretely derives its efficacy, unquote. And the footnote says, quote, this means that being in no way requires nothingness in order to be grasped, and that one can exhaustively examine its concept without finding the slightest trace of nothingness within it, end quote. Sartre. Nothingness, then, has only a, quote, borrowed existence, end quote. It, quote, derives its being from being. Its nothingness of being is encountered only within the limits of being, and the total disappearance of being would not be the beginning of the reign of non-being, but, on the contrary, the simultaneous vanishing of nothingness. Non-being exists only on the surface of being, end quote. Sartre. This is the last footnote, and this is in relation to the sentence. The foregoing demonstrates that Sartre draws upon Hegel's philosophy only in a few specific respects. And the footnote says, thus one can uphold the point Teunissen makes when he attributes to Sartre an inadequate understanding of negativity and dialectics. For the failure to grasp dialectics within a social scientific For the failure to grasp dialectics within a social science reduced to sociology, see by way of example Jürgen Ritzert, Was ist Dialektik? Parenthesis, Schriftenreihe des Fachbereichs Gesellschaftswissenschaften der Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität. In Kleines Lehrbuch der Dialektik. See Heiko Knoll. I'm not going to read all these. There's just citations in German books. Got to move on here. Thus, focusing on the problem of the beginning, being and nothing, entails not only a thematic limitation prescribed by Sartrean philosophy, but also the need to resist the temptation to sketch out a substantive interpretation of Hegel at this juncture, as doing so would exceed the scope of this study. The necessity of addressing the cautious hints made here, moving beyond their generalizing elements to treat them in a manner adequate to the theory, must be taken up elsewhere. Presupposed here is a specific connection that appears outwardly as a relationship between philosophy and science, yet presents itself imminently as a demand that philosophy must be science. Although the account of the problem of the beginning, of being, nothing, and becoming, presented here suffers from significant oversimplification, partly because it can only serve as an explanatory digression rather than a substitute for a detailed analysis. It is nonetheless necessary at this point. Okay, so that is the end of this fucking chapter. Oh my god, that was brutal, wasn't it? It would have been, it's not that it's not interesting, it's just like I feel like I have to have fucking a much deeper background in Hegel than I do. Anyway, thanks for listening.